Hello, my name is Fraser Thompson. I'm a Senior Fellow at the McKinsey Global Institute. McKinsey Global Institute is the economic research arm of McKinsey & Company, and I lead our work on natural resource issues. McKinsey has looked at natural resource issues both from the perspective of governments and the perspective of businesses about how they could shape both competitive advantage and changes in livelihood over the coming years. And what's interesting when we think about natural resources, a useful starting point is to understand what's been happening with the prices of natural resources. And if you look at Exhibit 1, you get a sense of what's been happening with resource prices over the past century or so. And if you look at what happened over the course of the 20th century, the truly amazing thing is that despite the fact that population increased fourfold and economic output increased more than 20-fold over this period, resource prices fell. And they didn't just fall by a small amount, on average they halved. Now, if we look what's happened since the turn of the century, that situation has more than reversed. And natural resource prices, covering everything from agriculture to energy to various metals, have on average doubled and in some cases tripled. And not only are prices high, but the volatility of those natural resource prices are extremely high. Now, the big question is what's going to happen next? And we don't have the crystal ball on natural resource prices. But it's very interesting to understand what's happening in terms of the demand and the supply outlook in each of these different natural resource categories. And if we think of demand, first of all, we see that over the next 20 years, we're expecting up to 3 billion new members of the global consuming class. And the global consuming class starts as low as $10 consumption per day. Most of these new consumers are going to be in China and in India. And these economies are transforming themselves at a rate that is historically unprecedented. If you look at slide 2, you see some of the major economic transformations the world's seen in the past few centuries. Now, if we go back as far as the Industrial Revolution in the UK, we see that it took 150 years for the UK to double average incomes. And they started with a population of just 9 million. Now, if you fast forward to what's happening today, it's taking China and India 12 and 16 years, respectively, to do what it took the UK 150 years to do. And rather than starting with a population of 9 million, they're starting with a population over 2 billion. So in other words, what's happening today is an economic transformation which is 10 times as fast and at more than 200 times the scale of anything we've seen in history. Now, in the supply landscape, whilst we're not running out of natural resources, we are finding that supplying and meeting this demand is becoming increasingly challenging. And it's not only to meet the incremental demand, but it's to replace supply that's coming to the end of its natural life. Peter Voser, the outgoing CEO of Shell, I think actually said it best when he mentioned that just to keep oil supply constant, the world has to find the equivalent of 4 Saudi Arabias or 10 North Seas over the next decade. The other interesting aspect of the changing resource landscape is what's happening in terms of the interlinkages of resources. Now, slide 3 just gives you a bit of a picture of some of the linkages between these resources. And it's complex, and it's deliberately complex, because this gives you a sense of these evolving, intricate relationships between all these natural resources. It used to be that resources were largely uncorrelated with each other. Energy markets were disconnected from agriculture, which were disconnected from metals. That is no longer the case. Most people talk about the links between the energy market and the agricultural markets through first-generation biofuels, but really that's just one of the important linkages that's developing. Increasingly, there's quite significant linkages on the production side, and these could strengthen going forward. To give you one example, as the world shifts from onshore oil to offshore oil, that uses 4 times the amount of steel per barrel of oil. Now, when you look where that steel comes from, the 2 major components are iron ore and coking coal. And 40% of the world's new iron ore projects are in water-scarce regions. When you also consider that agriculture demands 70% of water, you start to very quickly see all these intricate linkages which are developing between resource markets. Now, what does this mean for society, first of all? Well, there's a number of risks, and some of them are shown on page 4. There's implications for the economy. And the IMF has shown that for every 10% increase in the oil price, that can knock roughly 0.2 to 0.3% of GDP growth off. It matters for welfare. The World Bank has shown how the recent food price increases drove 44 million people below the poverty line. It also manages for public finances. For many countries, they spend more on energy subsidies than they do on health and education combined. And finally, it obviously matters a huge amount for the environment. The other aspect that sometimes gets lost in this is how important this is becoming for competitive advantage for businesses. And page 5 just gives you an overview of some of those implications. In terms of rising operating costs, first of all, for many food and beverage companies, input costs from natural resources are becoming a major driver of their P&Ls. And there's been a divergence in the returns between food and beverage companies, particularly over the last 5 years, between those companies that have been better able to manage those costs and pass them on to consumers, and those ones that have been less able to do this. But there's also a number of potential risks for businesses in terms of supply chain disruption, as well as license to operate. And these are likely to become increasingly important over the coming years. Now, that's the challenge. There's also a huge opportunity here, both for governments and for private sector. And I just want to spend a moment talking about this and where we think some of the really exciting opportunities could be. In 2011, we did a report that looked at where the major resource productivity opportunities are across agriculture, water, energy, and materials. And we found a host of different opportunities from extraction to conversion to end use of resources. But there was 15 opportunities that we found that really mattered. And these 15 opportunities are shown here on slide 6. The biggest opportunity may be familiar to many of you. It's around building energy efficiency, so both retrofits of existing buildings, but building new buildings more efficiently. But there's a host of other opportunities that kind of have been going underneath the radar, so to speak, today. One of them is around food waste. So an incredible amount of food gets wasted in the supply chain, roughly a third, even before it hits consumers' fridges. Another big opportunity is water leakage. Here in the UK, more than 20% of water gets wasted through leaking pipes. In some states in the US, that's north of 50%. And then there's a range of opportunities in the metal space, everything from producing metals more efficiently to thinking about scrap recycling to thinking about closed-loop systems. Now, how are countries going at actually capturing some of these opportunities? We're doing some ongoing research at looking at which countries are making the most progress on some of these resource productivity opportunities and what are the lessons learned and what they've done. And the really interesting aspect of this research was it threw up some surprising results. The first one, and as shown here on slide 7, is that there's huge variation across different regions in terms of their performance on these opportunities. If you look first of all in terms of food waste, and this is just in the supply chain, in North America, food waste is roughly at 16%, whereas in parts of Africa, it's double to almost 3 times those levels. If you look at oil recovery in Norway is almost double the levels it is in Saudi Arabia. So a range of quite varied opportunities across different countries. And also what that means is that a lot of opportunities to learn from what other countries are doing in each of these spaces. The second thing was interesting is that a lot of best practice on resource productivity is in very surprising places. Take water leakage, for example. Cambodia, and particularly Phnom Penh, has made some of the most rapid improvements of water leakage from rates that were above 70% to now rates that are low as 6% and below many European countries. And finally, the really big surprise is that many of the biggest improvers are in surprising places. So take electric and hybrid vehicles, for example. Albeit the penetration rates are low, but France, as shown here on slide 9, has actually been one of the most significant improvers over recent years. So what can we learn from these different case studies? We looked at which countries had made surprising and big improvements in each of the resource productivity opportunities. And you can see this list on slide 10. Now, I won't go through all of them, but one of the interesting aspects is when you look at this slide, you see that the different countries all these examples come from. There's no one country that really owns best practice. And we find this an interesting, exciting insight in that it means that countries need to understand what different countries are doing and what they can take from these different geographies. Just to give you a couple of examples, in food waste, Korea is doing some very interesting work on trying to reduce food waste across the supply chain and actually started charging in different regions for some of the food waste that gets thrown into bins. In other cases, you're seeing some interesting examples on things such as smallholder crop yields from everywhere as Morocco to India. And similarly on things like oil and coal recovery rates, Norway has been really championing the cause. So a lot of different pockets of insights here that we can learn from. Now, what's the general takeaways that we can get from this? Well, we found that whilst the various contexts differ significantly between all these places, there was 5 common lessons. The first one is that leadership matters, which sounds obvious, but it's particularly important in the case of resource productivity. A lot of these changes have started through the leadership of a few select individuals that have been able to galvanise change. In the case of water leakage in Cambodia, it started with some officials that really recognised the need for change and were able to bring the different stakeholders together. When you look at urban densification and around transport usages, in public transport in particular, mayors have often kick-started this. Here in London, it was driven by the London mayor on congestion pricing as well as subsidies to public transport. There's also a real lesson around demonstrating and role modelling. A lot of this change requires new procedures, new ways of doing things, and role modelling this to show it how it looks in practice has been quite important. Morocco did this quite successfully with a series of pilot projects around smallholder aggregation farms. The third is around mitigating the downside. All these changes have quite significant losses for some select groups of individuals, and being able to find effective compensation mechanisms for some of these ones that are going to lose out is important. In the case of Singapore, in their water reforms, they actually targeted low-income households and gave them quasi-cash to offset the rising water charges. Fourth area is around developing new talents and skills. And again, a lot of these changes require new capabilities, which also creates new opportunities for employment. And some of the most successful cases across these opportunities, from Australia and its own water reforms to what Norway did and to what various other countries have done, have started with a strong emphasis on building the right capabilities to succeed. And then finally, from a policymaker perspective, it's crucially important to tailor the intervention to the right barrier. Some of our current research is looking into those specific barriers, and they range from everything from information failures to coordination issues to supply chain difficulties. And the countries that have been most successful have been able to effectively understand which is the really key binding constraint here that's preventing change. So that's more of the policymaker lens. I'd just like to finish up with a bit of what this could mean from a private sector standpoint. And slide 12 gives you a basic overview of how we see different companies arraying in their efforts on resource productivity. And we see most broadly these 4 groups of companies. There's a group that we call the kind of wait and see companies that are actually not doing much on this resource agenda, but due to the uncertainty with resource price volatility, etc., they're largely just doing a business as usual approach. Now there's a second group, which we call the toe in the water group, that it's starting to do some basic things around resource efficiency and are starting to think about the communication on sustainability issues. Then there's a third group, which we call going green, that are really trying to make active strides on everything from energy efficiency to things like closed loop systems to reducing material intensity in their businesses. And then finally there's a fourth group, and this group is a much smaller group, but these ones are really rethinking about how they can shape the entire industry around resource efficiency and gain a unique competitive advantage. And these are the ones I find personally particularly exciting, because I see some of these as the business models that could be the heart of some of the most interesting investor and economic opportunities over the next 20 years. So obviously there's a variety of different implications for businesses, but to finish up, I'd like to just share 5 things that we see as likely to be common areas of action that businesses need to think about. The first is around risk assessment. We find that many companies really struggle to understand the full risks that they face from natural resources, particularly in the supply chain. And so companies need to get better at understanding the different interlinkages between resources and their dependencies, and how this could affect everything from their operating costs to supply chain disruption to license to operate. A second area is around increased resource efficiency. We find that many companies have just really scratched the surface of the different resource efficiency opportunities. And the ones that have done better have actually taken an active approach to really benchmarking and measuring their performance across different plants and, where possible, across other industry operators. The third area is around product design to cost. And what we mean by this is really thinking about the composition of a product and how it can be altered to best take advantage of changing resource landscapes. So substituting different materials for others where possible, and thinking about the whole product structure, not just the sourcing of it. Fourth area is around extended supply chain management. For many companies, they have a lot of strong in-house capabilities, but they don't apply them to their supply chain, which is often less sophisticated. But some companies are really starting to think this through and trying to see how they can work more effectively with their supply chain to improve their own capabilities of managing some of these resources, knowing that everyone will benefit from it. To give you one example, Siemens has done a major energy efficiency program where it's worked with suppliers to improve their energy efficiency rates, and it's become its own business. And finally, the really exciting bit is around this realization of alternative business models. There's a range of new business models that have been starting to develop, from everything from asset utilization, so car sharing, for example, and companies like Zipcar or Relay Rides in the US, to other programs around closed-loop systems. So Michelin, for example, which has started to sell vehicle hours rather than the tyre. So consumers, rather than buying a product, start to buy a service. So it's in summary, it's a changing resource landscape that we're seeing. And what's exciting is over the next 20 years, we see that those governments and those companies that are able to really think through how this will shape both societies and business, we believe are going to come out ahead. Thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.